Hey everyone, this will be my video explaining how I fit all of this water cooling gear and two graphics cards into this Corsair 350D case. I have a couple other videos on my channel of installing different components when I used to have 780 Ti's in this computer, and then in addition to that, I will be uploading a time-lapse video of me putting together this rig as it is now. So you can check those out too if you'd like to see more about this rig. But the focus of this video is going to be mainly on explaining how I fit things into the system to kind of maybe help out people who have the same case and want to do something similar, or have a similar sized case and want to do a custom water cooling setup with two dual 120 radiators. So we'll go through just the quick components that I have in here. The system has two EVGA 980 Ti hydrocoppers. So these GPUs are made by EVGA and the water blocks are made by EK. The pump and the pump top are made by Coolants. The pump is actually a D5 pump, and then the reservoir is also Coolants. It's a 50 millimeter. For the radiators, we have a 45 mil in the front from Watercooled, and in the top we have a 30 mil also from Watercooled. The motherboard is an Asus Gen 6 with a 4770K. The CPU water block is also made by Coolants, and then we have an EVGA 1000 watt power supply that is their silent edition. And then all five fans are Noctua NFF12 fans. And then I also have two SSDs, the Samsung 840 Pros, and they're both in RAID 0. The RAM is Corsair 16 gigs. So now I'll just go over the path that the water takes. We'll start here with the pump. It comes out of the pump behind the pump here towards the motherboard tray. You'll see it in a second, but it comes out of the pump, and then it comes up this blue tube right here into the front radiator, through the radiator, and then out the top of the radiator through this tube into the CPU block. The water then comes out of the CPU block into this short tubing here, up into the top radiator, through that radiator, and then out through this front tube down into the GPU. Now the two GPUs are connected with a Sli Water Connectors, and there's two of them right here, and they're set up to be parallel, so that means that the water goes through both of them, and the temperature of the water between the two graphics cards kind of equalizes, as opposed to having the water go through all of the first card and then all of the second card, which could give you slightly different temperatures between the two cards. There's pros and cons to both of them. You can read more about it online or see other videos, but in this case I needed to have two connectors between the cards, because there's no way to use there's no EK water block that bolts on for SLI. After the water goes through the GPU, it comes out the bottom here with this 90-degree fitting. So the water comes out this 90-degree fitting here through this short tube, and then back into the pump, which you'll see in a minute. I'll turn the system around so you can see the back of the pump. So these radiators fit into this system pretty easily, with a couple little things that I had to do special. Like I said before, the front radiator is 45 millimeters, and it just barely fits into this case. As you can see here on the top, it actually touches the 5 1/4 inch bays, and the radiator is sitting on the bottom of the case, so it fits in there pretty perfectly with using the two ports that are on the side here for my tubing, as opposed to the ones on the top. And then of course the fans are in the front of the case, and they're holding the radiator in place. Now the top radiator also fits relatively easily. It's a 30 millimeter with the fans, of course, all and the entire system are 25 millimeter, and it just barely clears the top of the motherboard tray, or excuse me, the top of the motherboard, and it actually does extend into the 5 1/4 inch bay, as you can see right here. So if you were going to do something similar here, you wouldn't be able to put an optical drive into that top 5 1/4 inch bay. It does stick in there a little bit. And then in addition to that, there is a slight modification that has to be made. So the aux CPU power cable which is right here, of course, in its regular location for most motherboards. That cable actually barely fits between the motherboard and the radiator. I had to use zip ties to kind of keep the cable together and turn it, curve it in the way I needed it to fit through that tiny little gap there. And although there's room for the cable and for the connector to plug into the motherboard, there is actually not room for the clip on the power cable. So here's an example of what the power cable looks like, as I'm sure you're familiar with. This clip right here, the regular clip that is used to connect power cables, I had to actually snap it off for the one that's in the system because there's literally no room for this clip, which actually kind of faces the radiator. It faces up, and there's no room for it. There's room for the connector itself, so it's plugged in there fine. It's not bent, and the actual connector on the motherboard is not bent in any way. It's just there's no room for this clip here because the radiator actually butts right up against this power connector. So in the Corsair 350D, there's usually hard drive cages right here for 3.5-inch hard drives, and then up here there's 2.5-inch drives for SSDs. I obviously had to remove those to make room for the front radiator and the pump res combo. So be aware of that. There's other places to put the hard drives, as you'll see in a little bit, but you will have to remove those to fit this much water cooling gear into the system. So the tubing fits into the system pretty straightforward, except for the fact that the case is just so small that it is hard to get your hands in there to get the tubing onto the compression fittings. One kind of tip is to use 90 degree or 45 degree fittings whenever you can, because it really makes a difference. There's so little amount of space that a lot of the tubing can't make the tight turns it might need to. So definitely plan out the loop before you buy components, and maybe even buy a couple extra fittings, whether they be straight or 90 degree fittings, just in case you actually have to run the tubing a way that you didn't think you would need to run it. Like I mentioned before, the graphics cards, they don't actually have tubing in between them. They have these male-to-male just straight through connectors, but these ones are made for going in between graphics cards, so they can actually extend to different lengths depending on how far apart your graphics cards are. So this is a larger example of the connectors I have in my system. It's just a male-to-male straight through fitting, but it's actually two separate pieces that have an O-ring in between them, so you can actually extend it or shorten it depending on how far apart your GPUs are. And then once you get it set to the right length, you'll tighten it down. And I have two of them in my system, in each port coming in and out of the GPU. So you then screw it in between your two graphics cards. So another option that I experimented with for my pump was using a shorter reservoir. I had a 30 mil res that would basically let the res clear this GPU completely. As you can see now with a 50 mil res, it actually touches the GPU right here. So it scratches the acrylic res a little tiny bit. It's not really an issue because the parts are not moving, but it is actually touching. So any GPU longer than 10.5 inches, which is what that 980 Ti is. I don't know if they make ones that are longer than 10.5 inches, but anything longer would actually completely block off this space for a res of this size. If I had used a smaller res, I could have in theory pushed the entire pump and the res combo. I could have pushed it into the case more, which might have looked a little bit better, but in actuality, I would have lost space that I need behind it that you'll see in a minute, where I have my drain valve. So that wasn't really a better option than using a 50 mil res and just having the pump all the way up against the window of the side panel. Now, in my older videos, I actually had this pump positioned a little bit differently. When I had 780 Ti's in the system, the pump was actually rotated 90 degrees to the left. So the inlet and the outlet were actually right here on this side. And what I had coming out of the GPU was a tube just going straight from here right down into the pump. It was a very tight turn for the tubing, and so it put a lot of pressure on the fittings on either side, particularly the one coming out of the GPU. And it just didn't look very good because of how short it was. So actually, that's part of the reason I decided to rotate the pump to the way it is now. In addition to that, there's a metal right here. You can see there's a little metal flange on this bracket, which is part of the pump. That bracket is used for attaching the whole pump res combo onto a radiator, which of course is not an option for me, so I don't really need it. But when the pump was originally turned 90 degrees to the left, this metal flange was actually hitting the window of the side panel, which wasn't very good, and it looked kind of weird. So in general, I think this setup with this pump the way I have it now, due to the size of the D5 pump and just the size of the pump top and everything, I think this is the best configuration, considering I have the 45 mil radiator in the front, and then a 10.5 inch graphics card close to the pump. So here you can see the back of the pump that faces the motherboard tray, where we have the inlet and the outlet. Like I said before, the water comes into this port right here from the lower GPU, goes through the pump, and then comes out this port. Now, outside of this port is where I have the tubing to go into the front radiator, and then also this little setup right here, which is the drain valve. So this is the setup, pretty much the same as the one that I have inside the case. It's basically two main pieces put together by male-to-male connectors. The first one is this T connector right here, which comes out of the pump on this side right here. And then this additional piece is the on-off valve, which when it's in the off position will stop the water from going through it, and then the water will be forced up the T connector through this port here, which is the one connected into my tubing that goes into the radiator. So the whole little setup just screws into the pump like this, and then is aligned so that the compression fitting goes directly up into the radiator, and then I have the on-off switch turned like so, so that I can get to this little valve. On the end of the on-off switch, I have just a regular cap right here, which you would, when it's time to drain it, you unscrew it. It's just there to stop any leaks getting through the on-off valve. You would unscrew it and then add your fitting here with some tubing on it so that you can drain the system through a tube. Now, one thing that's really important if you're going to do some kind of setup like this is to make sure you use the correct fittings in between these two pieces here. What you're going to want to make sure you use is the rotary male-to-male connectors. So what that means is that each side of the connector is able to rotate independent of the other. So that lets me, as you can see here, rotate the pieces. And I'm not tightening the connectors down anymore. And if I were to go to the left, I wouldn't be loosening them. The reason you need to do this is because if you use a standard male-to-male connector, such as something like this, whenever when you're done screwing in the fittings on either side of it, they're going to be positioned just whichever way they're positioned when the threads end, which will not really work, as I learned the hard way. When I was done screwing in the T connector into the pump, this hole on the top was not facing upwards, so I wasn't able to connect it into my tubing. And then in addition, when I screwed in the on-off switch, once it was screwed in all the way, the actual valve here was like underneath the radiator and bumping into the radiator, so there was no way to get to it. So I actually had to completely scrap that idea and buy these rotary fittings, which are they're super helpful, and I recommend using them pretty much in any any situation where you might need a straight through male to male connector like this, if you have the money, I would say just get a rotary connector instead. They're a bit more money, because they're technically two separate pieces with some O-rings inside them. Make sure you get the rotary kind so that you don't have to worry about how your fittings are positioned once they're tightened all the way down. So the other thing to see behind the motherboard tray is where I have hid my SSDs. There's the two 840 Pros, they're in RAID 0, and I actually just use regular Velcro, not the heavy-duty stuff that I used on the pump, but regular Velcro, double-sided Velcro to connect these two SSDs to the motherboard tray. In addition to that, I used a very thin SATA data cable, which you can see right here. It's much thinner and much shorter than the traditional cables that come with motherboards. They're made by Silverstone, and I have one here. So I use these on all of my SSDs or hard drives, pretty much in any of the builds I do, because they're so much easier to tuck away and to hide when space is at a premium. These ones are 300 millimeters, so they're extra short, which really helps. And then the connectors on them are 90-degree connectors, and they're extremely small compared to the traditional data cable, which helps out when space is at a premium. So in addition to the SSDs, I also have a standard 3.5-inch hard drive. It's from Western Digital. It's the black edition, 4 terabyte. And I have it up here in the 5.25-inch bay using a special bracket that I bought online. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's just a metal bracket that the hard drive screws into, and then the whole thing slides into the bay as if it were an optical drive. So that makes good use of that space there, since I lost the standard hard drive bays with the water cooling setup. So this hard drive is secured in here, and then I'm also using the thin data cable, just like the SSDs. And for the power cable, I actually cut off a traditional SATA power cable that had like 3 or 4 connectors on it. Since I only needed one, I cut all the other ones off and then used some hot glue and some electrical tape to cover up those exposed ends. So there's not too much cable in here that's not needed. This is one thing that I kind of learned really helps when you're trying to do a build like this with such a small case, when you have 2 radiators, custom water cooling, and then 2 graphics cards as well, is you really got to try to use as little cable as you can, because it all does add up in the end when you have excess cable. So whether it's using a shorter fan cable or cutting cables if you have to, like I did, really try to minimize the amount of just unneeded cable inside the system, because you have such little space to begin with. So I have 5 fans in this system. They're all Noctua NFF12s. The one in the rear is one of the older ones. That's why it's still tan and brown. And then the other 4 are the newer industrial grade ones that are black, thankfully. So I have the one in the rear is actually an intake fan, which I'll explain in a second. But most cases, the fan that's on the back of most cases is supposed to be exhaust, so it doesn't come with a filter. But you actually can buy a magnetic filter that you can either use screws and put it through the holes, or it has magnets on it, so you can put it anywhere you need on a case. I went ahead and got this one. It's 120 by 120, so that this fan can be an intake, and I don't have to worry about sucking dust into the system. You can buy these filters also at the 140 size, and then I think even the dual 120 or the dual 140. So that lets you basically turn a fan into an intake that wouldn't normally be an intake, and as such you don't get a filter with the case. Now these front fans are also intakes, and they're pushing air from in front of the case through the 45 mil radiator. The 350D case, it comes with a filter that would go right here, so there's no issue with that. But one thing I do want to let you know is, because of these radiators I used, they're both alpha cool, and one thing that's odd is the screws that came with these radiators. The head on these screws are so small that they actually went straight through the holes of the fans, and so I wasn't able to use them like that. I actually had to get these little brown washers from another water cooling piece of gear that I have to to use it in conjunction with the screws, which is not really ideal. But those are the screws that came with the radiator. Oddly enough, I actually have newer Alpha-Cool radiators that I got recently, and they actually have different screws with them that have a much bigger head. So be aware of that. You might, if you use Alpha-Cool radiators, you might get screws that have very small heads that would go straight through your fans. So in the top of the system, I have my other two fans, and these are the only two fans that are exhaust. And they, of course, pull air from inside the case up through the radiator and then out the top. The 30 mil radiator is also Alpha-Cool, so the screws that came with that one as well have these small heads on them, so I have to use washers on the top of the system as well. So the reason I went with 3 intake fans in the front and the rear, and then the 2 exhaust fans in the top, is because I wanted to have positive pressure inside the case, which that basically means that there's more air being put into the case than there is being exhausted from the case, and so that causes positive pressure, which essentially any holes that are in the case that don't have a fan on them, there will be a slight airflow out of those holes because of how much air is inside the case. What that airflow does is it actually makes it harder for dust to get inside the case through those other holes. I'm not really sure of any scenarios when you would need negative pressure inside of a case, because there's no airtight cases, and so any holes that the case has where there's no fan, there's going to be dust trying to get into those holes. But with positive air pressure inside, it'll be harder for that dust to get inside the case. So that pretty much sums up my overview video of how I fit all this water cooling gear into the 350D along with the 2 graphics cards. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave a comment on the video. If you have any questions about something specific on how I fit it into the system, I hope this video can help people who want to try something similar with this case, or other similar cases, as there's a lot of MATX cases that have the same basic setup, where you have the power supply here, and then you would have drive cages here, and then the optical drive bays up here. So it's kind of a similar setup to a lot of MATX cases. So hopefully this video can help out people trying to do something similar. My next plan is to actually build a similar system with these components, except it's going to be in an even smaller case. So you can take some guesses as to what that might be, but we are still going to go 2 graphics cards with an MATX motherboard, and then custom water cooling with multiple radiators. So I figured I'd try to do basically what I've done here in the 350D, which is a relatively small case, see if I could do it in even a smaller case. So go ahead and subscribe to my channel so you can check out that video when it comes out later. And other than that, thank you for watching.